Good afternoon. I'm Sherry Hennessy, Vice President of Member Engagement and Strategic Partnerships for BioNJ. I thank you all for joining us for this very timely program today. Today, our panel of experts will explore de-risking cybersecurity for emerging life sciences companies. We are going to hear from life sciences CEOs, CFOs, and CIOs about the real-world cybersecurity challenges facing emerging companies. Plus, cybersecurity industry experts, including the FDA, will share some of the practical ways to address those challenges. Get ready for an action-packed session. As a reminder, today's program does go until 1:15, and we hope you'll stay with us. A special shout out to our hardworking planning committee who brought this program forward. They are an amazing and fun group of people. And another thank you to our sponsors, Mercer and Marsh, Permevo, and Verve Group Consulting. Without you, we could not put on such great programming. Thank you. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available tomorrow on our website, bionj.org. We have many in the room today, so we will try to get to as many questions as possible at the end of the panel. Please type your questions for our panelists in the Q&A box, and if we don't get to your question, we will follow up after the program. So let's get started. To introduce our panel and lead today's discussion, please welcome co-founder and managing director of Verve Group Consulting. I always want to transpose that. Larry Semelo. Welcome, Larry, and thank you also for your generous sponsorship of this program.
Oh, it's our pleasure. And thank you, Sherry. And good morning, everyone. Very exciting today. So our IT and Cybersecurity Awareness Committee has been hosting these educational seminars for many, many years. And what's really cool and interesting today is we have our largest audience ever. So obviously, it's clear that cybersecurity risks are still and continue to be a big concern for the leadership teams of emerging life sciences companies. Now, of course, cyber risk exists for all life sciences companies, right? All companies in general. But here's the thing, as everyone on the call knows, for pre-revenue and early revenue life sciences companies, how we address those risks are always impacted by the obvious, limited operational cash at times, the limited ability to bring on headcount at times. And so the question really is for today's discussion, how do we as emerging life sciences companies address cybersecurity risks, but do so in a practical and budget-friendly manner? That's the question. And luckily for us, we have a fantastic panel, and they're going to help us find that out today. So let's just meet the panel, please. Randy, if you'd like to start off.
Sure. I'm Randy Melby, the CEO of Theramune. You could say we're a microcap. I would say based upon my market cap, I'm more of a nano cap company, but started the company in 2017, went public in 2022, 2 full-time employees only.
Great. And Susan?
Yes, good morning. My name is Susan Blum. I'm the CFO of Melinta Therapeutics. I oversee the finance team, including IT. So we've been working through cybersecurity and enhancing our cybersecurity program for the last few years. And so I'm happy to be here today and talk more about cybersecurity and how we can protect our company and our employees.
Terrific. Thanks, Susan. And Mark, please.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Mark Pellegrino, CIO for Insmed Incorporated in Bridgewater. Glad to be part of this panel and to talk more about cybersecurity and, of course, the vulnerabilities and how we protect ourselves. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Mark. Paul, please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Paul Fang. I'm the Senior Director here at BeiGene. We're a global oncology company. And, hopefully we'll share some great info on cybersecurity today.
Terrific. Thanks, Paul. And Dan, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dan Burke. I'm the Chief of Cyber Operations and Training for the FDA's Office of Criminal Investigations. And my division encompasses everything from cybercrime unit, which is illegal online pharmacies, to medical device hacking, our insider threat, because our Office of Internal Affairs is there as well, to our digital forensics unit and technical surveillance. So all things cyber and criminal with FDA. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Dan, for being here. Two more introductions. Jim?
Hey everyone, Jim Ambrosini here. I lead the cyber advisory and compliance practice at Compass MSP. We're a leading technology service provider. I've been in the business of helping public and private companies understand and manage their cyber risk for probably about 30 years now. Most of that has been in consulting, and very happy to be here.
Terrific, Jim. Thank you. And last but not least, Chris, and also a big shout out to Marsh, one of our very generous sponsors today.
Thanks, Larry. Hi, everyone. Chris Rios here. I'm a Senior Vice President and Cyber Risk Advisor at Marsh's Global Cyber Practice.
Terrific. Thanks, everyone. Well, look, this is going to be fairly informal, a lot of Q&A for our attendees. We want you to jump in with questions. We have that box so you can enter questions in, and we're going to try to look at that box along the way. So we have some questions we're going to start off with, but if the audience wants to jump in, we'd certainly welcome that. So let's kick it off. Randy, as your company continues to develop and work through all of the pre-commercial stages it's doing, what type of cybersecurity topics are coming to mind for you guys?
Well, we've done the basics of the cybersecurity insurance. From day one, we put that in place. We have a program in place. And if you look at overall the artificial intelligence, the cloud, I guess the one issue that comes up the most at board meetings is third parties. And when we're transitioning now from preclinical to clinical, what's the cyber hygiene that the clinics, the sites where we're doing the studies, how do we address that? Or is there some standard language that we need to make sure that's in these agreements, or how do we go forward? Because we can control what we can control, but it's the other parties that we're interacting with that I have more angst about.
Right. Okay. Well, Jim, let's start off with you. If you could give your perspective, please.
Yeah, I would just add to that, third party risk, what we call fourth party risk, which is the third party to your third party, probably one of the biggest threats in the industry. I would just say, in addition to all the due diligence and, all the great things, that Randy said, the one piece that I often see missing is understanding, the CROs or any third parties, what their incident response protocols are and notification to you, right? Because if you're relying on them and their data, if anything happens, you want to know very quickly, and you want to make sure that's contractually obligated, because I can tell you from working many breaches across industries, when it comes time to notifying someone, there's of course, the fiduciary duty to the state, et cetera. But when it comes time to notifying customers, companies go through the list and say, okay, who are we contractually obligated to note and by when? And it's literally almost like a tiered ranking. So, based on, the level of data and the reliance you're placing in that data, I think it would be paramount to ensure that you have some protections in place, not only about their program, but if anything goes wrong with that data, that they will notify you within an appropriate period of time.
Right. And that so you're talking about sometimes the contract language, right? So when we go through contracts, sometimes we look for things that the CRO presents to us, right? Okay, they're a good and worthy CRO. So they're going to throw paperwork our way, right? Because we're the small.
Yes.
So does anyone have any sense on what do you look for, or what should you look for in the language? And maybe, something that would be key to add, to a company like any of ours.
Well, I would just say, breach notification is an important one. Have a whole clause, so obviously you want them to protect the data the same way you would, right? So there's obviously some due diligence around that, but I was talking specifically about if the data that they are, preparing and hosting for you, if becomes compromised in any way, you would want to know about that. So you want to make sure you have a specific clause in there, and you could get as detailed as you want. It could be a material breach. It could be, if I've seen it worded more broadly, if any security incident happened that could affect the data, that's probably where you want to go. You'd want to know about it so you can make some strategic decisions.
Got it. Thank you.
And I would add, since we do a number of clinical trial fraud cases, data integrity, et cetera. So, I'd piggyback on that. It's any sort of incident involving data integrity, leaks of data, insider threat sort of issues. I think you would want to know about that.
Great.
Another thing I would add is, I like the idea about breach controls and understanding if there are any breaches to be notified as soon as possible. I think the other thing that is important to do is to send out, without doing a full audit of any of these vendors or partners that you use, but to ask just a couple of key questions about their controls at a high level. Make sure it meets your standards. If it doesn't meet your standards, then kind of have them dig deeper about explaining this. I mean, there's been times when we've had to turn vendors away just because they didn't meet our standards. So that's unfortunate, but I think it's a learning experience from both sides.
Fantastic point, Mark. Thank you.
I think just from an insurance perspective, requiring vendors to carry liability insurance, cyber or technology errors and omissions could be a critical step as well.
I think from the execution standpoint, sorry, Larry.
Okay, please.
From the execution standpoint, I think one big thing that often gets missed is the transition between like a contract and the execution side on your security team or your IT teams. They may know who to, initially contact, but that interaction between teams is not there. And the response time between that. So if you can, as building the contract or building the relationship with the CRO or whatever vendor that you're doing, is define those items in more detail instead of just a contact, right? Because when a breach happens, like Jim mentioned, you want a quick response. And if you're trying to contact the contact and that's not on the cyber level, communication kind of breaks down sometimes. And so you really want to bridge that gap that's there between that execution level.
Fantastic. If I can ask a follow-up question. So if thinking about the very good CROs out there, I mean, I guess I'll ask Mark, I mean, how flexible are they? How open are they to being flexible for the client's concerns?
I mean, I think that's vital to their business. They have to comply, number one, with any GxP standards. They also have to ensure that's their lifeblood. I've been part of audits for CROs and going out there with the big ones and the good ones. You're quite impressed. I was quite impressed as to their controls and the documentation. It's so heavily documented. Documentation is just one half of that. I also want to have them demonstrate. So I think, ensuring that all of those are in place is paramount to that partnership. And you also have to check references, things like that. I think it's a matter of, setting up that relationship to really gain that trust. It's got to be that two-way trust.
Excellent. Anything else on this particular topic, and we can always come back?
I'll just say one thing about a recent cyber attack that happened with Change Healthcare, and that wasn't a CRO, but it had to do with fulfilling prescriptions. And they're really a kind of, if you ask me, we're the biggest company in the space, and when they were affected, it kind of affected the entire sector. And I think it really helped to kind of bridge that gap to have other companies that were competing in this space to kind of step forward and kind of keep that from a monopolized area. I think that was a big lesson learned for preparedness for companies such as us and other biotechs, just about where you're sourcing your scripts, and having that continuity really is something that it was a lesson learned for most of us.
Good. Thanks so much for bringing that up, Mark. Susan, let me ask you, as your company continues to evolve and mature, how have, if you will, the cybersecurity concerns evolved?
Yeah. So similar to Randy, we have in place the basics. We have cyber insurance, And the last year, we focused on tightening up passwords, tightening up MFA. We've also implemented an awareness program for employees. So how, as we continue to mature, what KPIs should I be looking at, or should companies be looking at, to make sure that we are measuring the effectiveness of our program? And also, what should we be thinking about in terms of, as we mature, what kind of benchmarking can we do to make sure we're staying on top of what's evolving?
Great question. From our group, Paul, Chris, or Dan, and
Yeah, I
Jim.
can. I can add a little bit. I mean, I think what you point out, I mean, healthcare sector is one of the most breached sectors, right? Anytime, you see one of those reports, it's always in the top 5 of list. And then some of the data that comes out that says that, anywhere between 30 to like 60% I've read of data breaches are caused by insiders. And so, Susan, I think that you're kind of keyed on that. Now, how do you gauge that? We consistently through, within the FDA and through HHS, do phishing exercises with our people. And that's part of our education campaign. And it's really eye-opening as to how educated or sophisticated, your users are to identifying just simple phishing. And so, that's one of the things there's a number of companies out there that do that. And then they can provide sort of real-time reports, and it's a good education thing. It kind of becomes a game, right? I'm always looking for it to make sure that I'm the guy that, reports it. Just to give you kind of some data, we did one recently. We had over 17,000 employees were tested. And of those, around 1,000 actually, caught the phishing, the test. So 17,000, only 1,000 caught it. The good news is, there was the rest just sort of simply ignored it. But there were around 40 or 50 that clicked on the link. And that's where you have your vulnerability, right? And so those are the ones that we need to focus on. Those are the employees that we need to educate, because all it takes is one to, and our network is kind of a juicy attack surface, if you will. So, I think those campaigns are super important.
Yeah, I would add to that as well, Daniel. I think when we look at our biggest vulnerabilities, it's our employees. I think we can all agree to that. The layers of defense are fantastic. We have multiple layers of defense. I'll say that. But the awareness and the training is super important. And running these social engineering tests really gives them that real-time data. And you set a reward out there that if it's captured, what we do is we have a splash screen that pops up and says, "Congratulations, you passed this test," something like that. And then if it's missed, then what we do is we go back and have them retrain on some of the content that's relevant to that phishing expedition, whatever it happens to be. But the other thing that I think is important to note that we do here at INSMED is that we make cybersecurity and awareness as part of our culture. So it's hugely important that the awareness is there. You don't want to create paranoia, but you just want to have them aware. It also helps them to be better, even on their personal level with their personal systems.
Yeah. I would just add a couple of things. The question really gets into, how do you track the success of your cyber program, right? And what do you measure? I love the responses. I mean, the security awareness training, who's taking it, the success of that, you want to see it trending. I'll throw out a couple of others that we've used very successfully. One of them is just basic, right? It's just tracking the remediation of the controls. Hopefully you did a risk assessment at some point, so there were gaps, and you want to present those gaps and see them, however often you present. This month we remediated this month, the next month, et cetera, to track it down. The other one I'm going to give you deals with what's called vulnerability density. Fancy word. All it means is presumably you're doing vulnerability scans. If you're not, you should be. So you do the vulnerability scans, and then you track the percentage of, let's say, critical to the rest, right? That's vulnerability density. We have some companies that they might have 60%, picture hundreds or even thousands of vulnerabilities, maybe 60, 70% are critical vulnerabilities. high density, right? Bad. You want to see that driven down over time. And the other one I would just throw out is just some basics, right? Status of backup checks, making sure that, they were all working, number of systems protected by endpoint, just some basic metrics. But I think, just to sum it up, I think the phishing security awareness paramount, vulnerability, and then tracking your risk or audit issues through completion are the top ones I think you should do.
Great. Thank you.
Susan, the insurance underwriting process can be quite telling as well. If you go into that underwriting process unprepared without the proper privacy and security controls in place, insurance underwriters are quick to deny or decline to quote, which will tell you exactly what you need to improve on. And so aligning to the insurer expectations can be useful, or at least a good starting point. And then from there, I mean, the big brokerages like Marsh, Aon, Willis, and others have in-house proprietary assessment tools that we leverage to help educate and inform our clients on control deficiencies. And in some cases, like the Marsh assessment, we can also align that to controls benchmarking to show you where you stack up against your peer group.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. We did that this year in connection with our cyber renewal. We had an advisor who evaluated our policy. We also did some benchmarking. We concluded we had a good policy terms, so we did increase our coverage this year as a result.
Yeah, I would also add, onto the insurance piece, the coverage piece is very critical in claiming insurance as well. If you don't measure if your endpoints, for example, are have the endpoint security not installed on them, that could be part of some claim that you couldn't claim, right? Or for example, you also may I heard you implemented MFA, which is great. Every company needs to have that in 2024. But in a lot of IT processes, there are bypasses that are created, right? And there are certain elements that could potentially go beyond what was intentionally, created, right? So having metrics based on those control items that Jim mentioned, and metric off of that, making sure that that's 100% complete, as you guys review, right? So I think those kind of coverage items are important, not just for your own safety, but also for insurance claim.
Thank you. Back to you, Larry.
Well, I was going to kick it over to Mark. Mark, two things. One, did you have any follow-up on that? And if not, I kind of wanted to get your perspective on how, your company's going through such fast changes. I wanted to ask you about the cyber there.
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the things that I like to bring up and get the panel to kind of weigh in on is the SEC ruling. I think that's one of the things that's top of mind, being a public company, understanding how to disclose and what to disclose and understanding the rule. Some of the things that we're doing to prepare for that. Number one is to understand it. So what we do is we sit with our counsel, legal counsel, both internal and external, also work with our auditors, just to ensure we're on the correct page and ensuring that whatever process it is that we come up with, which we have, that is documented and tested. And, one of the things that I kind of stress with the cyber team is that if we look at things that occur, there's a difference, and you need to understand the difference between an incident and a breach. Incidents are going to happen, and you have to just kind of understand are incidents things that need to be reported, and you have to come up with what your maturity level and your threshold is for disclosing. You have to ensure you're following the rules, obviously, but not all incidents lead to a breach, but a breach contains an incident or many incidents. So you have to just kind of understand that and ensure that the process is defined, understanding who needs to know, when they need to know, And more importantly, what is the mitigation that you're going to do to correct the issue? So I just like to hear a little bit more from the panel about what their thoughts are with the SEC rule.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I can take this as something very close to my heart as what's called a qualified board certified technology expert dealing with this topic. So this is the SEC rule. There's a couple of nuances. The first one, the main portion of it deals with incident response, right? They want to know the aspect and the impact, the blast radius and the fallout, right? What happened and how big of a deal it is. And it has some qualitative language in there that says, would this be material enough for an investor to make a decision on your company? Right? Again, like beauty's in the eye of the beholder, right? It's well, is it really material or is it not? Some things are so obvious, right? If you get hit by a ransomware and the company goes down, or you can't process, use the technology ability, it's pretty clear. One thing on that I will tell you is make sure you document in detail every incident, especially why you determined it was not material to disclose. The reason being is oftentimes in cyber, things happen. It looks like it's not that bad. And then 9 months later, we find out, oh, geez, they really were inside our network. And now this is a problem. So if it is material, it goes on the 8K, and there's also a separate form that gets filed. There's one other piece that a lot of companies overlook, and it's very, very important for new public companies, especially smaller ones, because you have to also disclose in your 10K the aspects about your cyber program. And I use that word program because they want to see cybersecurity. They want to know, like, you have to, if you look at good disclosures in public companies, it talks about, what are we doing? How do we assess risk? How do we keep the board updated? Who's qualified to determine this? And remember, and the mistake companies make is they start listing, their policies. Well, we have a policy for this, and we do phishing exercises. That's not going to cut it. They want to see an integrated program, an enterprise level risk management program that contains cyber from the board level down. So all of those basic elements, you want to be able to talk. We do risk assessments. We do state-of-the-art threat detection. We have assessed risk. We monitor. We have people on the board, ideally, and I know this is a tough thing. Small companies qualified to understand technology risk. So that's the other piece that you have to do, even if you don't have a read. Your 10K has to have that detailed information as well.
Excellent, Jim. We do have a question from the audience. Now, look, in our audience, we have pre-revenue, early revenue, and some many more mature companies. But here's a question from the audience. Regardless of size of company, do you guys think of a checklist? Is there a checklist that you go to make sure you're covering, whether it be for Jim or anyone on the call, make sure you're covering the basics, right? So let's say you're a small company, not public yet. What are some topics that should be on any type of checklist?
Maybe I could take a first stab at that.
Yeah.
I think first, the checklist that I would go off of is a framework first approach, and understanding your risk within your whole company first. Within, like, for example, the NIST framework, it will define for you what to look for, and what to put in place. By following, a base set of standards, then you can build off, okay, what technology will I put into this, particular area, or what technology am I going to cover this risk in this, this other area, right? So I would definitely first choose a framework that you're going to base your program off of, and then look at, okay, how am I going to fill those gaps that I currently have?
So I can talk to that too. So that's exactly what we did at Melinta a couple of years ago, but we don't have cyber experts on board. So we engaged some advisors to support us, and they completed that assessment. And then there's gaps, and we prioritize those gaps in terms of remediation. And I can tell you some of the first things that we did were the things I mentioned earlier: password protection and password policy, tightening those up, making sure every device logging into your network is subject to the policy that requires changing your password every so often. But multi-factor authentication was also at the very top of that. I can tell you that the multi-factor authentication has actually stopped individuals outside of the company from being able to log in. We see some failed attempts with MFA. So we know that that is working. So those are some of the top things, but I think getting some insights from some advisors and then prioritizing the remediation steps. That's what we did, and it worked really well.
Great stuff, Susan.
Just to add on that, I think a couple of other things that maybe go a little bit beyond the basics, but also understanding the perimeter of your entire network, making sure that's not vulnerable. As I said earlier, I think the first and most vulnerable aspect are the people. But that perimeter check, also running penetration testing is hugely important. Learn a lot from that. And then patching. I can't stress enough how important patching is, not only from the server level, but also from the desktop and laptop level. So those are things I would add to.
Great.
Yeah, and there's one other thing I'd add just from a government perspective. There's tons of just material out there that CISA produces, HHS produces, NIST, as we mentioned there. There's all sorts of information that are good frameworks and things follow. Even now with medical device cybersecurity, FDA is sort of in the nascent stages of publishing their pre-market cybersecurity guidance and whatnot. So there's lots of resources out there that are easily accessible.
Yeah, Dan, that's a great point. And I think maybe segueing into the next question here, I mean, starting with an incident response plan is critical. There are some off-the-shelf plans that you can adopt that you can find on the open internet. Insurance brokers and insurers have those resources as well. And that will tell you really what actions to take, as well as following discovery of a potential incident.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. Thank you, everyone. In terms of the board, let's say whether you're a private company or public, I'd love for everyone to get a sense or give a sense of, how do you approach the board, right? You're not trying to have an overly technical discussion, right? Because the board is looking at risks and how we manage them. But what are some of the ways to help, let's say, a non-technical board member understand the actual concerns about cybersecurity? How do you phrase it? What are some of the things you can say to get folks to understand first and then buy into the need for some budgets?
I can start there. So we actually have this as a topic of discussion at the board meeting, and also as brought up earlier on this, the auditors will bring this up too. Do you have something in play? And from a legal point of view, the SEC. So it's a topic of discussion. I think every board member, at least I have a very small board, but everybody recognizes that it can be a problem, whether it's artificial intelligence these days or in the cloud. But since, as I mentioned earlier, we're transitioning from preclinical, my board members are very astute and very open to making sure that we have things in play. Whether it's, we talked earlier about the framework, we've got the risk management framework in place, do the insurance, disclosure policy, we go over all that.
And they're receptive, right? I mean, or has it been a little bit of a transition from maybe not so receptive to receptive? Just curious.
No, they're very receptive to it. I mean, we see, your words are the cyber hygiene. We see this all over. We get all these news feeds of breaches and things and incidents and things like that. So there's an awareness that a system needs to be in place and that it needs to be active.
And I would just add, over the course of my career, I've seen a culture shift with some corporations too, where a breach would happen, and the first thought would be, how is this going to affect our bottom line? How is this going to affect the reputation of the company? But now we're almost sort of in a breach fatigue. It happens so much that sunshine's the best disinfectant, and I think that boards are starting to see that. Like, let's just get this out there and deal with it.
Interesting. Mark, you were going to add?
Yeah, I just think, it's important for us as CIOs or CEOs to educate the board and don't overcomplicate it. What they want to hear is the basics. They want to understand that. And what is also important for us to do to inform the board is to get in front of it and do reading on what other boards are interested in hearing. So if you get in front of that and you provide that information to them, you get less questions. We welcome questions, of course, because if there's certain things they don't understand or they want more clarity on, or the approach, we have to cover the basics. What are we doing? How do we protect ourselves without getting into too much detail about technical, because you'll lose them. You just want them to understand that there is a plan in place, there is a process, you're compliant. How do you deal with third party, like we talked about earlier? That's hugely important. And just ensuring that you bring them along. And then sometimes I'll put up a question to myself that I'm anticipating they may ask, and trying to get in front of it. And then you just want to have that conversation going and help them to understand. Just always be honest. Tell them exactly what's going on. Like I always say that with the breaches that Daniel was just talking about, the breach fatigue, nothing is ever 100%. And if anybody says that, they're lying. So we have to just always stay in front of it and making sure that they understand they have the right person and the right team in place. That's what they.
Yeah. Just one last thing I wanted to add on that. I always found it successful to try to weave the conversation into risk tolerance and risk acceptance, because every board I've presented to, someone will ask the same question, and they'll say, well, are we doing enough? Are we spending enough for cyber? It's the wrong question, because I appreciate the question, but it lacks context. It's really around what's the value of the digital assets, and are you comfortable with the level of protection given these risk factors? And it tries to drive the conversation around, some what ifs, and if the answer is, gee, we're really not comfortable with it, you got to look at cyber as kind of like an insurance policy, so to speak, right? There's a certain amount you may need to spend, and you have to be comfortable with that. But it's always, in relation to the assets and the level of protection and the level of risk that still exists within those assets. And it's important to try to get that across so they could have a meaningful conversation. Or if they're like, yeah, we know we're not perfect, but we're fine with the risk. Okay, I did my job. Or if it's not, well, let's put things in place so you can be more comfortable with it. Even if it's a budgetary issue, we could put things on the roadmap, and drive the change.
It's a good point, Jim. I think, boards want to make data-driven decisions. And we talked about assessments and how those can provide really meaningful insights around some vulnerabilities or gaps in your cyber program. But I think the next level, and to your point, Jim, is analyzing your particular risk, right? Looking at the probability of having a data breach, the probability of having a network interruption or a ransomware incident, and then taking that probability and scaling it to fully understand the range of potential financial outcomes if X scenario occurs, right? And how do we do that, right? It's coupling that assessment data with some layered on analysis, and many of the insurance companies or insurance brokerages or other cyber risk advisors have the ability to do that.
That's excellent, Chris. It kind of sparked what I was thinking. So for a growing company that doesn't yet have cyber insurance, right? How do you educate, kind of coach up a client who says, look, I know it's important, but we're going to do that 8 quarters from now? I mean, how do you help? Because really, you have to help them understand the need for cyber. But if they're not yet a cyber insurance client, how do you help them cross that boundary, if you will?
I think it's all about the education, right? It's running through the assessments, it's then running through the analysis and just showing them what's at stake. Because I think a lot of insurance likes to use peer benchmarking, and that only shows you what your peers are doing. And so that could be reasonably accurate or inaccurate, but it's more of keeping up with the Joneses and making sure that you're, with the pack. If we look at more advanced analysis, we can, as I mentioned earlier, look at those probabilities of your organization having a cyber incident, and then what the financial outcome could be given the severity of that incident. I think that is really telling and eye-opening for boards. Anecdotally, I just had a conversation with a very large life sciences company who had not purchased cyber insurance in the past. And about 2 hours ago, they sent in the order to bind insurance and purchase a very large cyber insurance program after going through that very detailed analysis around their particular risk environment and their exposures.
Interesting.
Just to piggyback on what Jim was saying earlier, I like the idea about the tolerance. You need to definitely discuss the tolerance with your board, and kind of make a recommendation about what it should look like, and then talk through it. Obviously, talk through it with your executive committee, and then present that to the board. But the other thing too, I think is hugely important, is your maturity level. They need to understand what that is, and you need to understand from a clear, objective perspective about where you land on that maturity. And again, just be honest. And it could be an area of opportunity to become more mature. And you have to really kind of step back and have that independently done, and look at yourself.
In terms of the overall marketplace, I mean, could anyone offer their perspective on what are the more common cybersecurity threats to biotech, to medical device, to pharma in specific? What are you seeing out there in terms of the latest from the bad actors?
Well, maybe I'll start off. So I always go from breach reports, and use that to drive some of the information. So there's a good one that I use called the Verizon Data Breach Report. Is well known in the industry. They track all the breaches. And in life science, there were actually 3 areas that accounted for about 70% of the breaches. Right, it was a system intrusion with like ransomware, a web attack, and then what they called miscellaneous errors, which could be everything from insider to someone losing, a laptop. So you kind of, if you have some industry data, and there's plenty of other ones out there, but you get a kind of a sense for how are they attacking the life science companies or whatever, the appropriate industry, and you start building some, because if that's the segue into your environment, the threat pattern, then you build some resistance, right? So if it's a system intrusion like ransomware, the key things would be, incident response plan, backup, endpoint protection, network segmentation, right? There's various controls that line up against those threats. So those are some of the big ones. I'm sure the panelists have seen others, but it's just trying to align the resources, if you will, towards the greatest threat. And this information is very well published from breach reports, from insurance data, et cetera.
Yeah, Jim, I think we've seen most recently cyber extortion demands, however, not tied as often to ransomware and more tied to data exfiltration. So a network intrusion coupled with data exfil, and then the threat actor coming back and extorting the customer using the data that they stole, and saying, we will delete data if you pay us the extortion.
Another thing too, that I think is relevant is about artificial intelligence, how it's gained so much press over the past few years. And, some of the things that we always have seen, which all of us have, I'm sure, is messages that are fictitious that come from your CEO or CFO that say to transfer money and all that kind of stuff. Well, now, there are these things called deep fake videos. I'd like to really understand from the panel just about what, it's a concern that I have. And it's about how we use, what tools and what methods are used that are really effective to identifying a deep. Some may be obvious, but it's not necessarily the case all the time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll just maybe start off again. So just so everyone knows, in the audience, a deep fake is using AI generated images and videos that are so realistic you can't tell the difference. And this is used for manipulation, not just by hackers, but even in, governments and warfare. There was a case where recently the Ukraine president was seen. It was actually a deep fake video. It was urging everybody to surrender to the Russian troops, right? You can imagine the morale hit, right? So this is a real big problem, because imagine getting a video or Teams message from your boss or the CFO of your company, and they're talking and it looks just like them and it sounds just like them, and they're asking you to do something. So there are technologies out there that are, but most companies don't have these type of high-end things. I'll just say there's two things I look for. One of them, check the mouth, because you could see, even on some deep fake videos, you'll see online, in advertisements, you'll see various political figures or actors and actresses. There's something that doesn't add up with the mouth and what they're talking. But the way that the real hackers get around this, they'll show it from far back, like it being like so you can't really see it. But there's one thing that all of these things have in common, and it's common across every instance of fraud and manipulation. It's a massive sense of urgency. So it's like, hey, we got this deal. I need you to send this money for this deal and wire immediately, right? There's always that push. It's the same thing. Maybe some of you have gotten those fake texts from someone from your boss, like, hey, I'm sitting in a meeting. I need you to go and get gift cards because I want to give them out. Could you go right now? It's the exact same thing, except done on a scale. So just keep that in mind. Even if it looks like your boss, there's a sense of urgency. Make sure you have a process. Banks are great at this. Doesn't matter, right? Like, the CFO of the company could come on a screen. Hey, I need you to do this right now. It's so important. No. There's a process in place. There's levels of approval. I need to call, right? That's some of the things. So just look for anomalies in terms of pressure and try to have some other process in place off channel. It's like, okay, I'm just going to text you the code, so I think that's really some of the key things.
Yeah, I would like to add, I think AI is definitely going to get even better, where a lot of these things you won't even notice, right? But when it comes to fraud and hacking, the asks are still the same, right? What they're going after is still the same, um, and um, and how they ask it is still relatively the same, right? So if how we have been trying to tackle it from our side is, um, a lot of these things that we have been seeing, like CEO deepfakes and whatnot, but they've been coming through unofficial communication channels, like a text message or a WhatsApp, message that isn't from a corporate communication channel, right? So what we've been doing is training individuals on, if these executives are paying you, outside of the normal communication channels, there has to be a level of awareness and understanding of what they're asking you to do, right? So those are the things that we're doing to wrap around this AI piece, because we know the technology is only going to get better, but they're really asking for either, your credentials, money, or data, right? So, as long as we train on those concepts and look for what people are asking, then I think we'll get ahead of that.
So I know the topic for today is about cybersecurity, but one of the things that I find is a risk, some of those are obvious if they're asking for money and such, like you could kind of bypass that. And I like the idea about watching them out, but I get concerned about branding and, erroneous information being shared, not necessarily something that's trying to rip you off or get something from you, but sharing erroneous information, especially for a public company. You have to, kind of combat that in some fashion. So, the other way, like you're saying, Paul, about the sophistication with AI, I think it might be a market out there to find an AI tool to combat the AI deep fakes. There might be something where you're kind of in this loop. So that might be an opportunity for folks to think about as well. So anybody that's on the call, if you're in development, make that tool.
We see this all the time with, typo squatting or cyber squatting and, theft of intellectual property. And, especially now with GLP-1s like Ozempic and whatnot, just the total copying of what major companies do and then, sort of put their own product out there. So that externally is a real concern. I know we've been talking about sort of internal, but externally intellectual property theft is really taken off.
Maybe like watermarking or something, so you can authenticate the video. I don't mean, just kind of thinking out loud. I just think there's.
Yeah, the National Association of Boards of Pharmacy a while back had proposed the .pharmacy domain, and didn't really ever sort of take off, right, instead of .com or and they still own that .pharmacy, but sort of one idea that they had to sort of get around. That was several years ago, and they're still the registrar of that.
Interesting. We have a couple of questions from the audience. In terms of, we're going back a little bit to insurance. So if someone has property or liability policy insurance, does that cover cyber, or is there a way that could cover it? I'd love to get Jim's perspective on that.
Sorry, what? I just want to make sure I heard the question.
I apologize. I apologize. I meant to say Chris. My bad. Chris, from our insurance expert. What do you think about folks taking that position?
Yeah, that may have been a good way to transfer risk 4, 5, 6 years ago and before, but the insurance marketplace went through a change within the past 5 years, and it was all around what we call silent cyber, right? To eliminate cyber coverages that may exist because certain insurance policies were silent, meaning they did not exclude or provide coverage within their policy from being there. And so property, casualty, and other non-cyber insurance lines have gone through that phase of removing and specifically excluding cyber perils from their non-cyber insurance policies. So truly, if you want to transfer risk via insurance, you need to purchase a cyber insurance policy now and going forward.
Great. Thank you. Also from the audience, and we're going to pivot back a little bit. So can we just talk about some of the basics for, let's call it an early stage preclinical private therapeutics company? How should a company like that just begin to formulate ideas to address cybersecurity? Anyone have any just some global thoughts on how to get started if you're a preclinical early stage company?
Larry, I'm sorry. Can you just repeat that question?
Yeah, so one of the audience members wanted to know, for an early stage preclinical private therapeutics company, how should they address cybersecurity from the outset? How should they take a look at it?
I think going back to the basics, like we were talking about earlier, no matter how small the organization is, make sure that you have effective equipment that's patched. It doesn't have to be the latest and greatest, fastest computers, because there's always budgetary, restraints, but make sure that they're patched. Make sure you have somebody who understands that and understands the basics about what emails look like that are attempts to gain access. Especially if you're new and you're kind of less of a target, because it depends on how many folks know about you. But what ends up happening is if you have some open certificates that are out there in the public domain, those get targeted. So even though you have 10 employees, that could be an easy target. So don't become an easy target, and just really ask the right questions about the protection, about, like I was saying earlier, about the perimeter. What I mean is create this moat around your organization. You have to get through that moat in order to get in, and then you have to manage what's inside. That's the way I would approach it.
Yeah. And I would say just sort of recently, cloud services really helps with a lot of that, the sort of normal management that you would have to do. So just know where your data is if you're going to put it in a cloud application. For us, it has to be FedRAMP certified, and there's a level of trust, but it also, helps with security and just the general IT stuff. So in a way, where we're at, especially with cloud services, it becomes a little bit easier to manage that data, and just make sure you know where your data is, and have good hygiene along with it.
I just wanted to mention one thing, and especially for smaller companies, startups, et cetera, the concept from the military, like brilliance in the basics. I'll say this, I've been in a cyber consultant probably since the .com era. I don't like saying that, it makes me feel old, but I see the same issues from 1995 to now. Sometimes it's, weak passwords, bad monitoring, bad backups. And a lot of times where companies fail, even large ones, it's because they miss something so basic. I mean, I've seen many companies where their backups weren't even configured correctly because no one was checking on them, right? Or they didn't have an incident response plan in place, or the passwords were weak, or they had this carve out for passwords where executives or others were maybe exempt from it for whatever reason, and those were the ones that got hacked. So, basic security, authentication control, encryption, network segmentation, and backups. If you have those pillars correctly, you're doing all right. There's a lot of other stuff you could add, but at least have those foundational things in place.
Yeah, and I think I would add on, as a small company, you may not have the resources yourself to do any of it, right? And my recommendation would be to, bring on a cybersecurity consultant like Jim. I'm not advertising him right now, but someone to help you through that process. I think that's important. If you're on this call and you're not a cybersecurity expert, that's where they would come in and help you through that process, right? And identify where you need to focus on, within your company.
Yeah, excellent point. And I think Susan brought that up as well. Sometimes what we don't know, right? We don't know, we can't ask about, right? So it would help to start externally as well. Another question, and thanks so much for the audience asking such great questions. So this is for any size company. A lot of people are working still remotely, and they have a hybrid employee base. Very specific question here. One company has government contracts, and they need to protect what is generally called confidential unclassified information, CUI.
Yes.
And anything about the Jim, I love with a smile. In terms of remote work and those type of concerns, anyone have any kind of overall thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, from the government guy, right? FISMA's this sounds like FISMA low material. So where that data resides has to be, sort of FedRAMP certified and whatnot. So those are the two guiding principles, FISMA and FedRAMP, and then NIST.
Yeah. You said CUI, right? Confidential.
Yes, confidential unclassified information.
Oh boy, do I know. So this comes from the DoD from a standard called CMMC, certified cybersecurity maturity model certification, and it's really designed for organizations that have this kind of it's classified. It's controlled unclassified information, so it's not top secret. There is a whole framework, NIST 800.171, that has 110 controls and 320 sub-controls that have to be put in place. From the standpoint of, this is like half of what my team and I have been working on for the last couple of months, because there's a requirement deadline for 2025. So for people working from home, it gets complicated because they have to have, secure connection, VPN. They should have approved laptops. They cannot have their own laptops. You cannot also have people working outside the country. You cannot have non-US based citizens working on the country. So if you're doing this and you have offshore deployment, you're going to fail. So it's probably the most stringent standard I've seen, because some of the other frameworks are like shades of gray. We have this. With this one, the bar is up here, and there's also a specific type of if you're actually doing that CUI for the government, you are going to probably need a different set of Microsoft licenses called GovCloud. It's called GCC High. Not to get too technical, it's very expensive and it's very difficult to implement. So you really need to know the standard and implement the control. But it all starts with encryption, access controls to a very, very high level.
Thank you, Joe. Appreciate it. Another question, kind of pivoting back a little backwards. So a lot of our client companies, a lot of our folks on the call are moving at some point from phase 1 to phase 2 when it comes to trials. I mean, are there some specific aspects of cybersecurity they should be more aware of as they move within the clinical trial continuum? Just wondering if anyone has any perspective on that.
Yeah, I think with site locations, sometimes you have really sophisticated sites, sometimes you don't. I think the data that goes into those sites is crucial. And I think with setting up the necessary portals where the information is kind of centrally located makes sense, but that's always top of mind when we start looking at the sites across the world.
Great. Thank you, Mark. In terms of, we talked about third-party risks and, third parties to third parties. The life sciences community is so based, especially early on partnerships, right, and agreements and vendors to try to help you out. Can we just talk a little bit more about how we help mitigate the risk for the client company when dealing with all of these outside vendors and supportive companies? I mean, what are some of the go-to ways you can help kind of rein in those vendors and at least mitigate risk? And that's for anyone who would like to weigh in.
Yeah, I think we talked about it a lot already on third party and fourth party risks. For us here at Beijing, it's a constant battle, with getting vendor risk assessments done, right? I think from the execution standpoint, it does take a lot of resources if you don't have a platform to help you manage how you're going to do it. And as the company grows, especially from small to large, your volume of vendors are going to exponentially increase, right? And you have to understand that you also have to staff up for that to be able to capture that. And I think many times in companies, that as companies grow, that part, kind of gets missed, that we also need to staff up on being able to tackle this particular, vendor issue, right? And then partnering with your legal teams is going to be very important because your elements of cybersecurity need to be in these contracts, and you also need to show that those are effective as well, right? When you're building that vendor relationship. So part of that is also getting together with your business teams to be able to communicate that to your vendors as well. So a lot of interdepartmental, collaboration and reach out from the cyber side. I think that's sometimes not common in a lot of the business development or business side of it, right?
Right, because those business folks have the relationships, right, with these third-party companies, and they're critically important to success. But obviously, weighing in with legal and weighing in with cyber obviously makes a lot of sense, Paul. Thank you. Before we wrap up, does anyone on the panel have any final thoughts or final suggestions at all?
Well, I would just add this. Cybersecurity requires some constant attention, and it's never it's one of these things where companies spend money and they're like, well, I spent this and I did this last year. Now it's 2 years later. You got to keep up with it. You have to risk assess, look at new threats, look at what's going on, in the life science space, the hacks, the threats, the risks, and, just keep preparing. It really is almost like a battlefield, and you have to take that approach to a certain extent of just assessing the risk and making sure that you have the proper protections in place.
Right. I guess the companies have to be on guard every day, right, Jim? But the bad actors only have to be right a single time to call it
Exactly.
bad. So you have to play offense. It no longer is just a defensive game, right?
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
well, thank you so much to the panel for being so open with their suggestions. Sherry from BioNJ, I'm going to pass it back to you before we officially wrap up.
Thank you, Larry, Jim, Randy, Dan, Mark, Paul, Susan, and Chris. Oh my goodness, I think this is the largest panel we may have ever had. We appreciate this. It's been extremely informative. Thank you all for being here. If we did not get to your question, we will circle back after the program. As a reminder, we are recording the session and it will be on our website, bionj.org. Look for it tomorrow. And thank you again to our sponsors, Mercer and Marsh, Permevo, and Verve Group Consulting. And if you aren't a member of BioNJ yet, please contact me to learn more about the many benefits of membership, and my contact information is there on the screen. We also hope to see you at a future BioNJ event, and you can visit our website again for that, bionj.org, for our full calendar of events. Next slide, I think, is the survey QR code that you can fill out to tell us about today's program and how you felt about it. We appreciate any feedback we receive, and we always look at it and act on it as best we can. And thank you for joining us this afternoon. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.